At 6:12 hours on a cold morning in March 1944, at RAF Debden in Essex, a 19-year-old American pilot climbed into a fighter aircraft that most of the men around him believed would become his coffin. The airfield was already awake. Engines coughed and roared in the damp air. Ground crews moved between aircraft with practiced speed, patching metal skin, checking fuel lines, loading ammunition. The smell of fuel and oil hung low over the concrete. This was not a training base. It was the forward edge of a war that was consuming pilots faster than they could be replaced. Second, Lieutenant Charles McCullar had arrived only hours earlier. His logbook was thin. His combat experience was non-existent. His face still carried the softness of adolescence. Among the men of the 4th Fighter Group, many of whom had been flying and fighting since before the United States entered the war, he looked out of place. Mechanics noticed him and shook their heads. Pilots glanced at him and looked away. No one expected him to last long. According to United States Army Air Force's doctrine, what would happen next should not have been survivable. Replacement pilots were assigned to experienced leaders and instructed to stay close. They were not expected to fight independently. They were not expected to engage superior numbers. They were certainly not expected to fly alone over enemy territory. Doctrine was clear. Lone fighters were hunted and destroyed by German pilots who specialized in isolating and overwhelming stragglers. Within 6 hours of his arrival, McCullar would violate every one of those assumptions. The mission briefing was routine and grim. Heavy bombers would fly deep into Germany to strike a major rail marshalling yard. Resistance was expected to be heavy. Known enemy airfields lay along the route. German fighter response was guaranteed. Escort fighters were ordered to protect the bombers at all costs. The P-51 Mustang was the best escort fighter the Americans had. Fast, long-ranged, and deadly in experienced hands. But it could not compensate for inexperience. In the hands of a novice, it offered no protection from poor judgment or panic. McCullar listened to the briefing without comment. He suited up quietly, parachute harness, oxygen mask, gloves. He walked to his assigned aircraft and climbed into the cockpit. The Merlin engine came to life, vibrating through the airframe. 1,200 horsepower answered his touch. He ran the checklist carefully. Controls free. Fuel mixture set. Radio checked. Guns armed and bore sighted dot around him. Dozens of other Mustangs did the same. Pairs lifted off into the gray English sky and formed up over the coast. McCullar flew. On the wing of his flight leader, a veteran captain with multiple victories. The radio crackled with short, clipped instructions. Stay tight. Watch your 6. Call contacts immediately. They crossed into occupied Europe at altitude. Below them stretched a scarred landscape of fields and towns under German control. Ahead, the bomber stream appeared, a long line of heavy aircraft droning steadily toward their target. Then the first failure occurred. McCullar's flight leader reported engine trouble. Smoke trailed from his aircraft. He announced he was aborting and turning back. McCullar was ordered to rejoin another element of the group. By the time he attempted to do so, the formation had already moved on. The sky around him was suddenly empty. Flying alone over. Germany was not a heroic choice. It was a tactical error. Doctrine assumed that survival depended on mutual support. German fighters operated in pairs and groups, using altitude and surprise to attack isolated aircraft. A lone Mustang, no matter how fast, was considered a dead man flying. McCullar knew this. He also knew that turning back meant leaving the bombers without cover in a critical sector. It meant admitting he could not complete the mission on his first day. It meant confirming every doubt the veterans had when they saw him step onto the airfield. He did not turn back. Instead, he climbed dot at 25,000 feet. The air thinned, and visibility extended for miles. He scanned the sky the way he had been taught, left, right, above, behind, again and again and again. Below him the bombers pressed on. Black bursts of flak began to appear around them, hanging briefly before dissolving. Then the attack came. Out of the sun, a formation of German fighters dove toward the bombers. Their approach was fast and coordinated. Cannon fire tore into the rear of the formation. One bomber dropped out, trailing smoke. McCullar saw them before they saw him. 9 enemy fighters. According to every training manual, a 19-year-old replacement pilot, flying alone, facing 9 experienced enemy aircraft, should have disengaged immediately or been destroyed within seconds. What happened next should not have occurred, according to United States Army Air Force's fighter doctrine. In early 1944, the situation Charles McCullar now faced was defined as non-survivable. Escort fighters were trained to operate in pairs or flights. Mutual support was the foundation of air combat. One pilot attacked while another covered his blind spots. When a fighter became isolated, doctrine was explicit. Disengage immediately. Preserve the aircraft and pilot for future missions. Lone fighters were not assets. They were liabilities. German air doctrine exploited this principle deliberately. Luftwaffe fighter units trained to hunt isolated aircraft. Experienced pilots positioned themselves above bomber streams, waiting for escorts to drift out of formation. Once a lone fighter was identified, they attacked from altitude and numbers, forcing the pilot into defensive maneuvers that bled speed and energy. Once slow, the target was finished. Statistics supported the doctrine. Replacement pilots had the highest casualty rates in the 8th Air Force. Most losses occurred within the first 5 missions. Lone aircraft losses were disproportionately high. Engagements against superior numbers rarely ended in survival, let alone success. Training manuals cited these figures as justification for strict formation discipline. McCullar violated all of it. He was 19 years old. He was on his first combat mission. He had no wingman, no flight leader, no support. His aircraft was fully fueled and armed, but fuel and ammunition did not compensate for experience. The aircraft itself imposed limits. The P-51 Mustang was fast, but speed alone did not guarantee safety. In combat configuration with external fuel tanks recently jettisoned, the Mustang's top speed was roughly 430 miles per hour. German fighters like the Focke-Wulf 190 could match that speed in a dive and outclimb the Mustang at certain altitudes. Firepower also favored the enemy. The Mustang carried 650 caliber machine guns, effective but requiring sustained aim and close range to inflict damage. The Focke-Wulf was armed with cannon capable of destroying a fighter with a short burst. In head-on or deflection shots, the German aircraft had a lethal advantage. Numbers compounded the imbalance. McCullar faced 9 enemy fighters. Even assuming equal skill, basic probability worked against him. He could engage only 1 aircraft at a time. The others could maneuver freely, attacking from multiple directions. Defensive flying against more than 2 opponents drastically increased. The likelihood of being hit. Doctrine addressed this explicitly. Pilots were instructed never to engage superior numbers alone unless escape was impossible. Engagement was considered acceptable only when surprise and altitude advantage were overwhelming, and immediate disengagement remained an option. McCullar had surprise. He had altitude. He did not have a clear escape route. The engagement geometry was unfavorable. The German fighters were positioned above the bomber formation, using the sun to mask their approach. This gave them both energy and visibility advantage. McCullar's position placed him behind and above them, but engaging would commit him to the fight and reveal his presence immediately. Once revealed, the Germans could reverse roles and hunt. Fuel considerations narrowed the margin further. McCullar was deep over enemy territory. Any prolonged engagement reduced his ability to return safely. Damage to the engine or cooling system would be fatal at altitude. Bailout over Germany meant capture. Doctrine treated capture as survival, but pilots understood the reality of landing alone among enemy civilians and troops. All of these factors informed doctrine for a reason. Fighter tactics were designed to maximize survival over repeated missions, not to achieve isolated victories. The system assumed that preserving pilots mattered more than individual engagement outcomes. McCullar single quotes as choice to attack contradicted that philosophy. From a purely mechanical standpoint, the odds were clear. A single Mustang attacking 9 coordinated fighters should have been overwhelmed within minutes. Even if he achieved surprise on 1 target, the remaining aircraft would respond quickly. Sustained engagement would bleed energy. Defensive maneuvering would expose him to cannon fire. The engagement window was short. Doctrine did not consider the possibility of sustained success under these conditions. It assumed that surprise could produce 1 kill at best before disengagement became mandatory. Anything beyond that was considered improbable. Yet doctrine also assumed that escort fighters would always be present in numbers. In this moment, they were not. McCullar was confronted with a choice that doctrine did not fully address: disengage and preserve himself while bombers were attacked, or intervene alone with limited expectation of survival. The manuals provided guidance, not compulsion. They defined what was likely, not what was required. McCullar understood the risks in abstract terms. He had studied them. He had been tested on them. He knew the numbers. What doctrine could not quantify was the immediate effect of an action. If he did nothing, the German fighters would continue their attack. Bombers would be lost. Crews would die. The formation would weaken, making subsequent attacks easier. Doctrine assumed enough fighters were present to prevent this scenario. They were not. McCullar's situation fell outside the assumptions on which the rules were built. The manuals described a world of formations and mutual support. They did not describe what to do when those formations dissolved unexpectedly. From the standpoint of training, physics, and probability, the engagement McCullar was about to initiate should have ended his mission quickly. Survival beyond the first. Exchange was unlikely. Engagement beyond the first kill was considered impossible. The doctrine was clear. And yet, McCullar rolled his aircraft into a diving attack and committed himself fully to the fight. Charles McCullar had turned 19. Only weeks before he arrived in England, he was among the youngest fighter pilots in the 8th Air Force. His path to the cockpit had been accelerated by wartime necessity rather than individual distinction. Before enlistment, he had lived an ordinary civilian life, marked more by routine than by ambition. There was nothing in his background that suggested an appetite for combat or exceptional risk. He grew up in the American Midwest, far from airfields and military bases. His pre-war work involved basic mechanical tasks and seasonal labor. He was familiar with machines, but not in a way that implied engineering insight or advanced technical training. His interest in aviation developed late and was shaped largely by circumstance. When he entered flight training, McCullar progressed steadily, but without distinction. His instructors described him as quiet and attentive. He followed procedures closely. He did not challenge authority. His evaluations noted solid aircraft handling and acceptable gunnery scores, but nothing that separated him from dozens of other trainees moving through the system. He was not considered aggressive. This mattered. Fighter pilot culture in 1943 and 1944 often favored assertiveness. Many instructors believed that hesitation was more dangerous than recklessness. Pilots who showed excessive caution were sometimes reassigned. McCullar avoided both extremes. He flew as he was taught. He memorized procedures. He relied on checklists. Rather than instinct. In aerial gunnery training, his results were average. He could hit a target when conditions were controlled. Under stress, his accuracy dropped slightly, as it did for most new pilots. His instructors did not expect him to score victories quickly. They expected him to survive long enough to learn. That expectation framed his assignment. When McCullar arrived at RAF Debden, he was paired with veteran pilots, not because he showed promise, but because that was standard practice for replacements. New pilots were supposed to stay close, observe, and gradually assume responsibility. Their role was to fill space and learn discipline. They were not expected to fight independently. McCullar understood this clearly. He did not arrive with illusions about his role. He listened more than he spoke. He asked few questions. He took note of how experienced pilots positioned themselves, how they scanned the sky, how they communicated under pressure. His instructors had emphasized one point above all others: never fly alone. German fighters hunted isolated aircraft aggressively. New pilots who strayed from formation rarely survived long enough to make a second mistake. McCullar had seen the training films. He had read the casualty lists. He knew the numbers. His confidence, such as it was, did not come from belief in his own skill. It came from belief in procedure. That belief was now under strain. That the loss of his flight leader was not dramatic. It was mechanical. Engine trouble. Forced an abort. The order to rejoin another element was routine. The failure to do so was not the result of panic or error. It was timing dot within minutes. McCullar found himself alone in airspace that doctrine defined as lethal. The choice he faced was not heroic in his mind. It was procedural. Turning back was permitted. There was no standing order to press on alone. No one would have faulted him for disengaging. Replacement pilots were not expected to improvise, but the bombers ahead were already under attack. McCullar had been taught that the purpose of escort fighters was singular: protect the bombers. Everything else was secondary. Victory counts personal. Survival, even aircraft preservation, were subordinate to that mission. This principle had been drilled into him repeatedly in training. It was abstract. In the air over Germany, it became immediate. McCullar did not weigh his chances of success in complex terms. He did not consider kill ratios or maneuvering diagrams. He considered distance and timing. He was above the attackers. He was unseen. He had speed. Those conditions matched the basic criteria taught for a successful attack. Attack from advantage. Disengage if the advantage is lost. He had advantage. What he lacked was support. McCullar did not believe this made success likely. He believed it made inaction unacceptable. This distinction mattered. He was not seeking combat. He was responding to a direct threat to the formation he had been assigned to protect. His decision was not framed as courage or defiance. It was framed as adherence to the core purpose of his role. The training system had not prepared him for this exact situation. It had prepared him to recognize when doctrine no longer addressed the problem in front of him. As he rolled his Mustang into the attack, McCullar was not relying on instinct honed through experience. He was relying on the simplest elements of what he had been taught: altitude, surprise, speed. Everything beyond that would unfold faster than thought. McCullar rolled the Mustang onto its back and pushed the nose down. The aircraft accelerated immediately. Gravity and engine power combined, driving airspeed past 300 miles per hour. The bomber formation expanded in his windscreen as he descended. The German fighters were now clearly visible, spread loosely behind the bombers, their noses pointed forward as they fired into the formation. They had not seen him. The sun was behind McCullar. His approach vector aligned almost perfectly with their blind spot. This was the only moment in which the engagement favored him. He selected the nearest aircraft and adjusted his line of attack. Training dictated short bursts. Ammunition was finite. Overfiring reduced accuracy and wasted time. He waited until the target filled the reflector sight, then fired. The Mustang shuddered slightly as 6 machine guns discharged. Tracer rounds arced forward. The first burst passed behind the target. McCullar corrected his aim and fired again. This time the rounds struck the fuselage and wing root. The German fighter lurched violently. Smoke erupted from the engine cowling. The aircraft rolled to the left and dropped away from the formation. McCullar did not follow it. Doctrine warned against fixation. Chasing a damaged aircraft invited counterattack. He pushed through the formation at speed, braking upward to regain altitude. Only now did the German pilots react. 2 fighters turned sharply, climbing to meet him. Cannon shells flashed past the Mustang. 1 round struck the wing, tearing away a strip of metal. The aircraft remained controllable. McCullar rolled and dove again, trading altitude for speed. The fight fragmented almost immediately. There was no single furball, no continuous turning engagement. Instead, the sky became a series of brief intersections, one aircraft crossing another's path at closing speeds that left no room for hesitation. McCullar avoided prolonged turns. He had been taught that energy was life. Every tight maneuver cost speed. Every second slow made him vulnerable. A German fighter crossed in front of him at close range, attempting to reposition toward the bombers. McCullar fired instinctively. The burst struck the cockpit area. The canopy shattered. The aircraft pitched downward and disappeared beneath the cloud-layered dot. Now the Germans understood the situation. They were no longer attacking an undefended formation. They were being engaged by an escort fighter willing to press the attack. Their priorities shifted. Instead of continuing to fire at the bombers, several aircraft turned toward McCullar. This was the critical moment. Doctrine predicted that this was where the lone fighter would be destroyed. Multiple attackers converging from different angles would force defensive maneuvering. Loss of energy would follow. A single well-placed cannon burst would end the fight. McCullar did not attempt to out-turn them. He dove again, using speed to separate. Tracer fire followed him briefly, then fell behind. He leveled out below the bombers and climbed back up, positioning himself again between the attackers and their targets. The German pilots faced a decision of their own, continuing to chase. McCullar pulled them away from the bomber stream. Breaking off allowed him to attack them again from above. Their original mission was already disrupted. One aircraft broke away and turned. Back toward the bombers, McCullar intercepted immediately. The geometry was difficult. The target crossed his path at an angle that required significant lead. He fired a short burst. The rounds struck the engine and wing. Flames appeared almost instantly. The German pilot bailed out seconds later. The number of attackers had been reduced again. The remaining fighters disengaged partially, climbing away and regrouping at a distance. They no longer pressed the bombers. The formation tightened and continued forward. McCullar stayed with them. He did not chase the withdrawing fighters. His fuel state was now a concern. His ammunition was nearly exhausted. His aircraft had taken damage. The engine continued to run smoothly, but he could not assume it would remain that way. The engagement had lasted only minutes, but it had consumed nearly all of his combat capability. German fighters did not return. The bombers pressed on toward their target. McCullar maintained position until the escort relief point was reached. Only then did he turn west. The return flight was long and uneventful. Alone again, he monitored engine instruments carefully. Oil pressure held. Coolant temperature remained within limits. Control response was slightly sluggish but manageable. When he landed at Debden, ground crews immediately noticed the damage. Bullet holes dotted the wings and fuselage. A round had passed through the tail assembly without severing control cables. Another had struck near the radiator intake. The aircraft had survived by margins measured in inches. Debriefing was brief. McCullar described the engagement without embellishment. He did not claim victories. He described what he saw and what he fired. Intelligence officers compared his account with bomber, crew reports, and gun camera footage. The numbers matched. Multiple enemy fighters had been destroyed or driven off. The bomber formation had suffered fewer losses than expected for that sector. For a replacement pilot on his first mission, flying alone, the outcome contradicted every expectation built into the system. The consequences of the engagement were assessed quietly and without emphasis. In the hours after the mission, intelligence officers compiled reports from bomber crews, escort pilots, and gun camera film. The accounts were consistent. A small group of German fighters had attacked the rear of the formation. The attack had been interrupted quickly. Several enemy aircraft had been seen falling away, trailing smoke or fire. No additional attacks occurred. In that sector, losses among the bombers were lower than projected. No one initially connected those outcomes to a single pilot. Replacement pilots were not expected to engage independently. There was no category in the reporting structure for such an action. The assumption was that experienced escort pilots had intervened and moved on. Only during debriefing did the picture become clearer. McCullar, single quotes, S account was simple. He described being separated from his flight. He described seeing the attack develop. He described diving on the enemy aircraft and firing until his ammunition was nearly exhausted. He did not attempt to estimate how many aircraft he had damaged or destroyed. He stated only what he observed directly. His squadron commander reviewed the report without comment. The significance of the engagement lay not in the number of enemy aircraft destroyed, but in the effect on the mission. The bomber stream had continued without sustained interference. The target had been struck. Crews returned alive who otherwise might not have. From a doctrinal standpoint, the engagement was an anomaly. It did not fit the model used to evaluate fighter effectiveness. Lone engagements were not supposed to succeed. New pilots were not supposed to alter the course of an attack. Yet the outcome could not be ignored. The response was administrative rather than theoretical. McCullar was credited with aerial victories after corroboration. The confirmation process took time. Gun camera footage showed brief firing passes and aircraft breaking away. Bomber crew statements supported his account. German loss records later aligned with the engagement window. Even so, the language used in official summaries remained restrained. There was no discussion of doctrine, no suggestion that lone pilots should engage superior numbers, no revision to training guidance. The engagement was recorded as a result, not as a method. McCullar was recommended for a high decoration. The citation focused on determination and effectiveness under adverse conditions. It did not describe his age. It did not emphasize that he was alone. It did not frame the engagement as a lesson. It framed it as an instance of duty fulfilled under pressure. This was deliberate. The Army Air Forces did not want young pilots drawing conclusions from rare outcomes. Loss rates were already high, encouraging individual initiative without support risked increasing casualties across the force. Doctrine remained unchanged. Replacement pilots continued to be instructed to stay close to experienced leaders. Lone fighters were still considered vulnerable. Engagement against superior numbers remained discouraged. From an institutional perspective, this consistency mattered. McCullar did not object. He did not present himself as an example. He did not claim that doctrine was wrong. He continued flying missions as part of formations, adhering closely to procedures. His subsequent sorties followed standard profiles. He survived them. The engagement over Germany remained his first combat experience, not his defining one. Over time, the incident became a footnote in operational history rather than a case study. It was cited occasionally in morale briefings, but without detail. The focus was on outcome rather than process. This reflected how military organizations absorb exceptional events. They acknowledge success without allowing it to distort expectations. They preserve systems built on probability rather than anecdote. McCullar single quotes, S. Survival and success did not invalidate doctrine. They existed alongside it as evidence that doctrine describes what usually happens, not what must happen. The war continued. Escort. Missions remained dangerous. Casualties continued. Most replacement pilots did not experience outcomes like McCullar's. Many did not survive their first missions. The manuals were not rewritten. The formations remained. The rules endured. McCullar completed his tour and returned. Home alive. The engagement that should not have been survivable passed into record quietly, marked by numbers and confirmations rather than emphasis or myth. In the weeks that followed the mission, the engagement was absorbed into the administrative machinery of the 8th Air Force. Gun camera film was reviewed frame by frame. Bomber crew statements were cross-checked against escort reports. Times, locations, and aircraft types were compared. The process was methodical and slow, designed to remove uncertainty rather than celebrate outcome. The conclusions were restrained. German fighters had attacked the bomber formation. The attack had been broken off sooner than expected. Multiple enemy aircraft had been destroyed or rendered ineffective during the engagement window. Losses among the bombers in that sector were lower than projected. The records confirmed that Charles McCullar had been alone. This fact was acknowledged but not emphasized. In official documentation, isolation was treated as a condition, not a choice. The focus remained on results rather than circumstances. This framing allowed the engagement to be recorded without challenging existing assumptions about escort doctrine. McCullar was credited with aerial victories after corroboration met the required standard. The confirmation did not rely on his testimony alone. It required independent observation. That requirement was met. A recommendation for a high decoration followed. The citation language was carefully constructed. It described determination under attack. It noted effective action against enemy aircraft. It stated that his conduct contributed materially to the protection of the bomber formation. It did not mention his age. It did not dwell on his inexperience. It did not describe the numerical disparity in detail. Most importantly, it did not describe the engagement as a model. This was consistent with institutional practice. Military organizations distinguish between acknowledging outcome and endorsing method. McCullar's success was acknowledged. The conditions under which it occurred were treated as exceptional rather than instructive. Doctrine remained unchanged. Escort fighters continued to be trained to fly in pairs and flights. Replacement pilots continued to be instructed to avoid independent engagement. Law statistics continued to support that guidance. In most cases, lone fighters did not survive encounters with superior numbers The engagement over Germany did not contradict those statistics. It sat outside them. McCullar continued to fly missions as part of a formation. He did not repeat the circumstances of his first engagement. He did not seek them. His subsequent sorties followed standard profiles. He relied on mutual support. He survived. There was no attempt to incorporate his experience into training syllabi. No tactical bulletins were issued. No revisions were made to escort procedures. This was not oversight. It was intent. Doctrine exists to reduce risk across thousands of sorties. It cannot be built around rare alignments of advantage, surprise, and restraint. What McCullar encountered was a narrow window where those elements converged. Outside that window, the same decision would likely have ended differently. The Army Air Forces understood this distinction. After the war, McCullar returned to civilian life without public attention. He did not write memoirs. He did not lecture on tactics. His service record reflected completion of duty rather than exception. The engagement itself faded into archival summaries. There were no monuments, no sustained discussion. The sky over. Germany changed as the war ended. Airfields emptied. Aircraft were scrapped or stored. The bomber streams ceased. What remained was a brief interruption in an otherwise predictable pattern. A lone escort fighter intervened. An attack was disrupted. A formation survived intact. The event did not alter air war doctrine. It did not redefine fighter employment. It demonstrated only that doctrine describes probability, not inevitability. Military systems are built to function most of the time, not all of the time. When circumstances fall outside expected parameters, outcomes may diverge briefly before returning to established norms. That is what happened here. McCullar's first combat mission ended not with loss, but with quiet confirmation. The records were filed. The conclusions were drawn. The system moved on. The war continued until it did not, and the engagement that should not have been survivable remained exactly what the documentation treated it as. An exception, recorded without emphasis, contained within the boundaries of a doctrine that endured long after the moment passed.